The sun was bleeding out across West Texas. A thin orange line laid down on the rim of the world like a brand still cooling. When Walt Beecham rode the south fence line and saw a shadow no taller than a fence post standing at his back gate, he pulled the reins. The mare went still. The wind was hot, dry, full of grit. And the shadow did not move. Walt rode closer, slow, the leather of his saddle creaking under him like an old door, and the shadow lifted its face. A boy, 8 years old at the outside, barefoot, filthy, holding a half-empty canteen in both hands like it was the last thing he owned in the world. The boy whispered 8 words. He said them in English first, then in Spanish. And then his knees folded under him like wet paper, and the dust took him. Now, before I tell you what Walt did next, you need to understand the man who was standing there. Because a stranger riding the fence line of his own ranch at sundown sounds like a small thing. But Walt Beecham, 64 years old that summer of 1887, had been riding that same fence line alone every dusk for almost 9 years. And a man who does the same thing alone every dusk for 9 years is not just checking wire. He is looking for something, even if he won't say what. Walt's outfit sat about 30 miles west of Pecos, in the long, flat country where the grass goes blonde in July, and the creeks shrink down to a damp memory under the cottonwoods. He ran around 300 head, branded with a simple B on the left hip. It was the kind of ranch a man builds with his own 2 hands and his wife's patience and his son's young back, and then keeps running long after the wife and the son are both in the ground. His wife Alina had passed 4 years before, a fever that came on a Tuesday and was finished with her by Friday. The doctor rode out from Pecos, looked at her, shook his head once and rode back. Walt had sat on the edge of the bed and held her hand until the hand went cool. Then he stood up, walked into the dining room, and looked at the long oak table he had built her as a wedding gift 28 years before. 8 chairs. Room for the family they had once expected to have. He stood there a long while. Then he closed the dining room door. He did not open it again. For 4 years, Walt ate his supper standing at the kitchen counter, or sitting on the back porch with a tin plate in his lap, watching the light fail over the brush country. The dining room stayed closed. The good china stayed in the cabinet. There are some rooms in a man's house, friend, that close themselves when grief moves in, and they don't always know how to open back up. And then there was Caleb, Walt's son. Caleb had been 19 years old when he rode out with 3 other young men to help a neighboring rancher who'd been hit by a Comanche raiding party, a small raid, the last gasp of a fading way of war. But the bullets in a small raid kill you just as dead as the bullets in a big one. Caleb didn't come home. They brought him back across the saddle of his own horse, wrapped in a wool blanket Alina had woven herself. He was buried on a low rise behind the ranch house, under a single mesquite tree, with a wooden cross Walt cut and planed by his own hand. That was 1878. 9 years gone by the summer this story starts. 9 years of an empty bunkhouse, loft where Caleb used to sleep when the weather was warm. 9 years of a saddle hanging on a peg in the tack room, Caleb's saddle, smaller than a grown man's, the leather darkened at the pommel where his hands had rested. Walt did not throw the saddle out. He did not pack it away. It stayed on that peg. The only soul on that ranch, besides Walt who knew what those empty things meant, was a Tejano cowhand named Lupe Ramirez, who had been Walt's foreman for 22 years. Lupe had ridden onto the Beecham place as a 20-year-old looking for a winter job, and had simply never left. He'd married a woman from Pecos named Aurora, a small, sharp-eyed cook with a low laugh, and the 2 of them lived in a whitewashed adobe house about 100 yards from the main house, with a kitchen that always smelled of dried chilies and good lard. Lupe and Aurora had no children of their own. The Lord, Aurora used to say, had simply decided otherwise, and she had simply decided to feed every cowhand within 20 miles to make up for it. Lupe had been the one who washed Caleb's body before they buried him. He had been the one who, 4 years later, dug Aliner's grave because Walt could not lift the shovel that morning. There are men in a man's life, friend, who become more brother than employee, and Lupe was one of those. But brothers don't fill the rooms a son was meant to fill. And by the summer of 1887, Walt Beecham was drifting, slow as a leaf on still water, into a quiet, polite kind of bitterness. The kind that doesn't argue. The kind that just stops opening doors. Which brings us back to the boy at the gate. Walt swung down off the mare faster than a 64-year-old back ought to allow. His knees hit the dust beside the boy, and he turned the small body gently, the way you turn a calf to see if it is still breathing. The boy was breathing. Just barely. The canteen had rolled out of his fingers. There was dried blood on the inside of his left wrist, and a long, ugly scrape down his shin, and his feet, Lord, his feet were cracked and crusted and swollen up like sourdough. He had walked a long way. "Easy now, Mijo," Walt said, even though he didn't speak much Spanish, just the words he'd picked up from Lupe over 22 years. "Easy. I got you." He gathered the boy up in his arms. The boy weighed nothing, friend, like a sack of feed half empty. And he climbed back into the saddle one-handed, and he rode the mare slow up the long, pale track to the ranch house, calling Lupe's name into the dusk. Lupe came out of the adobe with a lantern. Aurora came out behind him with a flour-dusted apron and a face that, when she saw the small body in Walt's arms, went tight and old in a way Walt had never seen before. "Mater de Dios," Aurora whispered. Trelo Acqui." They brought him into Aurora's kitchen, not the main house, the kitchen, and laid him on the long pine table where Aurora rolled tortillas. Aurora pulled the boy's filthy shirt off and went to work with warm water and clean rags, gentle as if she were washing a saint. Lupe held the lantern. Walt stood by the door with his hat in his hands. The boy stirred. His eyes opened dark, very dark with long lashes, and he flinched at the light. Aurora made a soft sound in her throat, the kind of sound mothers make in every language ever spoken, and she leaned close and whispered to him in Spanish. The boy listened. He swallowed. And then, in a voice no louder than a moth against a window, he started to talk. His name was Tomás. Tomás Rivera. He was 8 years old. He came from a small village down past Eagle Pass, near the river. His mother had died of fever the year before. He said this matter-of-factly, the way a child says a thing he has not yet had the strength to feel. His father had died before he could remember. After his mother, he had gone to live with his uncle Esteban and his uncle's wife Mariana. They had loved him, he said, and here his voice went smaller, like he was the son they had been waiting for. Esteban had taken work driving a small freight wagon north into Texas, bringing goods up to a merchant in Fort Stockton. He had brought Tomás and Mariana with him because, he had said, a family belongs together on the road. They had been 3 days out. They had camped at a wash. And then Tomás's voice nearly gave out here, and Aurora put a hand on his forehead. Men had come at first light. Anglo men, the boy said. 4, maybe 5. They had wanted the goods. Esteban had stood up to talk. They had shot him first. Mariana had run, and they had shot her too. Tomás had been under the wagon. He had crawled out the other side into the brush, and he had run until he could not see the wash anymore, and then he had walked. He had walked, by Walt's quick reckoning of the country, something like 14 miles. With a half-empty canteen. With no shoes. Across rattlesnake ground, the worst part of a drought summer. And he had walked to the first gate he saw, with a lantern hanging from it. Which was Walt Beecham's back gate. Which had a lantern on it because Walt, though he wouldn't have admitted it under oath, had been lighting a lantern at that gate every dusk for 9 years, in case Caleb ever came back. Aurora was crying quiet by then. Lupe's jaw was set hard. Walt stood in that doorway holding his hat, and something inside the man, something that had been closed up since 1878, made a sound like a door beginning to swing on a stiff hinge. "Feed him," Walt said. His voice was rough. "Feed him whatever he can keep down. Put him to bed in your spare room. I'll come by in the morning." He turned and walked out into the yard. He stood a long time under the cottonwoods. Then he went up to the main house and did not sleep. At dawn, gray cool, the sky the color of a tin pan, Walt saddled up. He took two of his hands with him, an older man named Hollies and a younger one named Tate, and he rode south. By mid-morning they found it, what was left of it. The wagon had been stripped and left where it stood. Esteban Rivera lay where he had fallen, and Mariana lay where she had fallen, and the buzzards had been at them, friend, and I will spare you the rest of the picture, because the picture is not the point. Walt got down. He took his hat off. Hollies did the same. Tate, who was only 20, turned away and was sick in the brush, and no one held it against him. They wrapped what was left of Esteban and Mariana in canvas. They tied them across the spare horses. They rode home slow, in silence, in the worst heat of the day. By sundown, they were back at the Beecham place. Walt had Hollies ride into Pico's for the priest. He had Lupe and Tate help him dig 2 graves in the small cemetery on the rise behind the house, the cemetery that until that day had held 1 wife and 1 son. They laid Esteban and Mariana down side by side, and Walt cut 2 simple wooden crosses with his own pocketknife, and he carved their names into the wood with his own hand. Esteban Rivera, Mariana Rivera, and underneath each, beloved. Resting, they were buried next to Caleb. The priest came the next morning and said the words. Tomás stood by the graves with Aurora's hand in his, and he did not cry. He had cried himself empty already. And Walt stood across the cemetery from the boy, with his hat in his hands, and he watched. He did not come closer. Not yet. For 2 weeks after the burial, that ranch settled into a strange, soft kind of quiet, what the old folks call a false calm, when the storm has stepped behind the hills but has not gone home. Tomás slept in Lupe and Aurora's spare room, on a small cot Aurora had made up with a quilt her grandmother had stitched. He ate what Aurora cooked. He did not speak much. He did not cry at night that anyone could hear, though Aurora told Lupe more than once that the boy whimpered in his sleep like a pup, having a dream he couldn't wake from. Walt did a thing I want you to notice, friend, because it tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He did not push. He did not try to make himself a father in 2 weeks. He went about his work. He rode the fence line. He cut hay. He fixed the windmill at the south pasture. And he watched the boy from a distance, the way you watch a stray dog you don't want to spook, and he let the boy come to him on his own time. On the morning of the 15th day, Walt was sitting on the porch of the main house with a tin cup of coffee in his hand, and a sunrise the color of peach skin laid out across the brush country. He heard small bare feet on the boards. He did not turn his head. The footsteps stopped beside his chair. A small brown hand reached out and set a second tin cup of coffee on the rail beside Walt's elbow. Tomás had carried it all the way from Aurora's kitchen without spilling a drop. Walt looked down. Tomás did not look up. The boy turned around and walked back to the adobe without a word. Walt sat there a long while. He did not drink the coffee right away. When he did, it was cold. He drank it anyway. And he sat on that porch with his eyes wet and his jaw working, and if you had been there, friend, you would have seen a man whose hinge had finally swung the rest of the way open. But this is West Texas in 1887, and a quiet morning of coffee on a porch is not how stories like this are allowed to end. 3 days after that cup of coffee, two riders came up the long, pale track to the Beecham place. One was the county marshal, a square-jawed Anglo named Pritchard. The other was a thin, nervous man in a black coat who introduced himself as the Indian agent. Though why the Indian agent had business with a Mexican boy, no one in that yard could quite say, except that in 1887 in West Texas, if a brown child without papers showed up in your county, all the men in coats came to look at him. They had heard, Pritchard said, that a Mexican boy had turned up at the Beecham Ranch. The boy had been listed as a missing minor. There was a Catholic orphanage in San Antonio that took in children of the raids, children of the road. He would be safer there, Pritchard said. Cared for. Educated. Fed. Walt stood on his porch with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his face like a board fence. He's fed here, Walt said. Pritchard cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable. He looked, in fact, like a man who would rather have been anywhere else. But he had his papers. And behind him, Walt knew, were 3 or 4 of his Anglo neighbors who had been muttering in town that the Beecham place was now harboring a Mexican stray, and that the boy ought to go where Mexican strays were supposed to go. I'll think on it, Walt said. Come back in 2 days. The men left. Walt stood on the porch a long time. Then he saddled up and rode into Pico's. He went to the courthouse. He asked to see the paperwork on the San Antonio orphanage. A clerk slid it across the counter. Walt read it slow, and what he read was this: the orphanage took in children. The orphanage put them out to work as soon as they were able. The orphanage's records on Mexican-American children in particular were thin. Many were placed in service to ranching outfits, mining outfits, or domestic households, with no further follow-up. The word placed did a lot of work in those documents, friend, and most of what it was working at wasn't kind. Walt closed the folder. He pushed it back across the counter. He rode home. The next morning, Pritchard came back, alone this time, and Walt was waiting for him on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hand, and Tamaz standing a little behind him in the doorway. Walt did not invite the marshal up the steps. He said 5 words, and he said them slow. He's mine. I'll go to court. Pritchard's eyebrows went up. The agent in the black coat made a small offended noise. Pritchard waved a hand at him to be quiet. The marshal looked at Walt a long moment, then at the boy, then back at Walt, and something passed across his face that Walt could not read but that he chose, for now, to take as decent. All right, Mr. Beecham, Pritchard said. Court dates in Pico's in 3 weeks. Get yourself a lawyer. The judge is Halloran. He's a fair man. He's also a strict one. You'd best be ready. I'll be ready, Walt said. If you've been listening this far, friend, and I hope you have, because this is the part of the story where everything turns, do me a small kindness. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the bell. There are more of these stories coming, and I want you with me when they do. Now, 3 weeks to a courtroom. 3 weeks for an old cowboy to prove to a judge in Pico's that a boy who had walked 14 miles to his gate belonged on the other side of it. Walt did not own a suit. He hadn't owned a suit since Aliner's funeral, and that one black wool, too heavy for August, had been packed into a cedar trunk and not opened since. He opened it now. He shook out the coat. Aurora pressed it for him on her kitchen table, with a flat iron heated on her stove, and she patched a moth hole at the elbow with stitches so small you had to know they were there. He hired a lawyer out of Pico's named Hollis Granger, no relation to the cowhand, a thin, white-haired man in his late 70s, who had ridden with the Confederate cavalry as a boy of 16 and had spent the 40 years since trying to make up for it by representing whoever the county was inclined to step on. Granger took Walt's case for $20 and a side of beef. He listened to the whole story in Walt's kitchen, hat on his knee, and when Walt was done, he was quiet a long while. Then he said, "Mr. Beecham, I've practiced law in this county 30 years. I've seen men try to take land off widows. I have not yet seen a man try to give a child a home and have to fight the law to do it. But here we are. We will win this. You speak plain. You let me handle the rest." The morning of the court date, Walt rode into Pico's with Lupe driving the wagon and Aurora and Tomás in the back. Tomás wore a small clean shirt Aurora had sewn for him. His hair was combed flat with water. He held Aurora's hand the whole way. The courthouse in Pico's was a low building of yellow brick with a single high-ceilinged courtroom and a judge's bench of dark walnut. Judge Halloran sat behind it, gray-bearded, hard-eyed, the kind of judge who had heard every story West Texas could tell and believed about a third of them on his best day. The agent in the black coat was there. The Marshal Pritchard was there. 3 of Walt's Anglo neighbors were there, sitting in the back row with their arms crossed. And sitting on the other side of the aisle was a small, round-faced priest in a worn black cassock, Father Domingo, from the Mexican parish on the south side of town. He had ridden in alone that morning. Walt had not asked him to come. Lupe had. The hearing took the better part of a day. The agent spoke first. The orphanage in San Antonio was the proper place for the child, he said. There were standards. There were procedures. A working cattle ranch run by a widower with no female relations was not, he said, a fit environment for an 8-year-old boy. Granger let him finish. Then Granger stood up slow on his old knees and called Walt to the stand. "Mr. Beecham," Granger said, "tell the court in your own words why you are here." Walt sat there in his black wool suit with his hat on his lap, and he did not look at the judge first. He looked at Tomás, sitting in the front row beside Aurora, with his small clean shirt and his combed flat hair. Then he looked at the judge. And he said, "Your Honor, I lost my son to violence 9 years ago this fall. I lost my wife to fever 4 years ago this spring. This boy lost his uncle and his aunt to violence 3 weeks ago, almost to the day. I have land. I have animals. I have a name in this county that nobody, fair or unfair, has had cause to question. The boy has none of those things. He needs all 3. I am not asking the court for charity. I am asking the court for permission to be useful with what I have left." The courtroom went quiet. Even the neighbors in the back row uncrossed their arms. Father Domingo took the stand next. He spoke in careful, accented English. He said Esteban Rivera had been a man of the parish, a quiet man, a hard worker, a man who had taken in his orphan nephew without complaint and who had been raising him as a son. He said that Tomás was, in every way the parish could vouch for, a good child, an honest child, a child who would honor whoever raised him. And then Father Domingo looked at Walt across the courtroom, and he said, in Spanish first and then in English, "This man stood in my parish house 3 weeks ago and asked me to come bury 2 strangers in his family cemetery. I have not met many Anglos in this county who would do that. I have met none who have asked nothing in return." Judge Halloran sat back. He looked at the agent. He looked at Walt. He looked at the boy in the front row. He drummed his fingers on the walnut bench. Then he leaned forward and he said, "I'm going to rule in favor of Mr. Beecham's petition. But the boy is 8 years old, not a head of livestock, and this court will not hand him over like a deed. Tomás Rivera, step forward." Tomás let go of Aurora's hand. He walked up the aisle in his small, clean shirt. His shoes, borrowed shoes, half a size too big, made a small sound on the floor. "Son," the judge said, "do you know what's being asked here today?" "Yes, sir," Tomás said. "And what is your wish?" Tomás looked at Walt. Walt looked back. Neither one of them said a word, friend, because some words don't need to be said out loud. "I want to go home with him, sir," Tamaz said. "Please." Judge Halloran nodded once. The gavel came down. And just like that, on a hot afternoon in Pecos in the summer of 1887, an old cowboy and an orphan boy walked out of a courthouse together, into the bright, dusty street, and the boy reached up and took Walt's big, rough hand without being asked, and Walt did not let go. They rode home that evening in the wagon. Tamaz fell asleep with his head in Aurora's lap before they were 2 miles out of town. Lupe drove. Walt rode alongside on the mare. The lantern on the back gate was lit when they came up the track. Hollies had ridden ahead to light it, and Tamaz woke up just in time to see it glowing through the dark, and he sat up and he looked at Walt, and he smiled. It was the first time, friend, since the night at the wash, that the boy had smiled. That was the night Walt opened the dining room. He carried the lamp in himself. He wiped the dust off the long oak table with his shirt sleeve. He pulled out 2 of the 8 chairs, one at the head, one beside it. Aurora brought in a pot of beans and a stack of fresh tortillas, and a plate of carne asada that filled the closed-up room with a smell it had not held in 4 years. Lupe came in behind her with a candle, and he said the prayer in Spanish over the food, and Tamaz bowed his small head, and Walt, who had not bowed his head over a supper table since 1883, bowed his too. The next morning, Walt walked Tamaz out to the tack room. He took down Caleb's saddle from the peg, where it had hung for 9 years. He brushed the dust off the pommel where Caleb's hands used to rest. He carried it down to the saddlemaker in Pecos that week, and had it cut down and refitted for an 8-year-old boy, same leather, same stitching, smaller tree. When it came back, it fit Tamaz like it had been made for him. And in a way, friend, it had. The bunkhouse loft where Caleb used to sleep became Tamaz's room. Aurora sewed curtains for the small window. Walt built a shelf for the boy's few things, a wooden horse Esteban had carved him, a small tin medal from the parish, a photograph of his mother that Father Domingo had recovered from the wagon. Walt taught Tamaz to ride. Lupe taught him to rope. Aurora taught him to read in Spanish, and Walt taught him to read in English, sitting at the long oak table after supper with a Bible and a McGuffey reader, and a lamp burning warm between them. The dining room was never closed again. Not once. 15 years passed. Walt is 79. Tamaz is 23. The ranch is doing well, better than well. They run close to 900 head, and the brand on the left hip has a new mark on it, a small T tucked just beneath the original B, because 3 years ago, in a quiet ceremony in the Pecos courthouse, Walt signed the ranch over to Tamaz Beecham. That is the name the boy chose for himself on his 18th birthday of his own free will. That is the name the county records carry to this day. Tamaz is married. He married a girl named Inia Cutes, Aurora's niece, up from a village near the river, and they live in the main ranch house with Walt. They have 3 children. The oldest is a girl, 7 years old, named Alina, after Walt's wife. The second is a boy, 5 years old, named Esteban, after Tamaz's uncle. The youngest is a boy, 2 years old, named Caleb. And the first time Tamaz laid that baby in Walt's arms and Walt heard the name spoken out loud in his own house again, the old man cried, friend. He cried like a man who has been holding his breath for 9 years and 24 years, and finally remembered how to let it out. The small cemetery has 5 graves now. Alina Beecham, Caleb Beecham, Esteban Rivera, Mariana Rivera, and as of last spring, Lupe Ramirez, who passed in his sleep at 73, with Aurora's hand in his and Walt at the foot of the bed. There is one more plot, marked but empty, beside Alina. Walt picked it out himself last fall. He told Tamaz, plain as a fence post, "That one's mine when the time comes, and don't you make a fuss about it." This evening, 15 years, almost to the day, after a small, filthy, barefoot boy stood at the back gate of the Beecham Ranch and whispered 8 words in 2 languages. Walt is riding the fence line. The mare is older now. So is Walt. The sun is bleeding out again across the rim of the world, the same orange brand laid down on the same flat country. And as Walt comes up the long, pale track toward the back gate, he sees 3 small shadows running, not standing this time, running toward him with their arms wide. Alina first, because she is the fastest. Then Esteban. Then little Caleb on his short legs, falling behind and laughing about it. Behind them on the porch, Tomás stands with Ineacutes tucked under his arm and Aurora, old now, gray, still sharp-eyed, beside them with a dish towel over her shoulder. Walt swings down off the mare. He kneels in the dust. He opens his arms. He whispered 8 words at sundown, "I have no one in the world." The cowboy gave him a ranch, a saddle, and a name. "Some gates, friend, open both ways."